Hey, you perverts and history buffs gathered here for a good, uncomfortable listen. Tonight's history lesson has too much moaning and too much blood to be boring, I promise. Forget what you've seen in those romanticized period dramas where the king's mistress swans about in silk, dripping pearls, and maybe sheds a tear or two when he finds a new plaything. That's fairy dust, my friends, sprinkled over a cesspool.
The reality of being a royal mistress across most of human history wasn't a rise to power. It was a slow, agonizing crawl into a gilded cage, often ending with a swift, brutal fall. You think it was all stolen kisses and whispered secrets, more like secret poisons and whispered prayers to avoid the noose. Let me know what shocked you most, because we're about to dive deep into the absolute filth of historical power plays, where intimacy was a weapon and love a dangerous joke. We're kicking this off in ancient Rome because where else would we find such a delightful cocktail of public spectacle and private depravity? Imagine, if you will, the Roman emperor, a man so powerful he could declare himself a god, and his concubines. Not just one, mind you, but a whole stable of them, often slaves, often taken by force. These women were not just for pleasure, they were trophies, bargaining chips, and occasionally unwitting poison conduits. The official empress, a woman of formidable power herself, viewed these lesser women as direct threats to her status, her lineage, and her very life. Think Livia Drusilla, Augustus's wife, who reputedly poisoned anyone who dared to stand in her way, including, perhaps, her own husband. A mistress, by comparison, was less than a fly in the empress's ointment, easily swatted, easily squashed. Picture a young woman, perhaps beautiful, perhaps just unlucky enough to catch the emperor's eye. She'd be brought into the palace, arrayed in finery, taught to please, to cater to every perverse whim of a man accustomed to absolute dominion. Her body was a public resource, paraded for the emperor's pleasure, her reproductive organs a potential factory for future threats to the legitimate line. Every throb, every moan was measured against the political climate. And what if she became pregnant? Ah, a Roman accident. History is littered with whispers of forced abortions, administered by crude methods or potent herbal concoctions designed to rip life from the womb. Or worse, the child was born, an illegitimate burden, a living testament to the emperor's straying penis, quickly spirited away to be raised by slaves or simply left to die. The shame of such an offspring was not on the emperor, of course. It was on the woman, the fertile, compliant vessel who had dared to carry his seed outside the bounds of sanctioned marriage. Public exposure was a common weapon. They didn't have tabloids, but gossip was currency, and an empress's network of spies and informers was far more potent than any paparazzi. Imagine your life, your very existence, hanging by the thread of a powerful woman's jealousy, a woman who had the power to order your quiet disappearance, a discreet poisoning, or a public accusation that would send you to the arena, not as a spectator, but as a meal for hungry beasts. Your body, once a source of brief, illicit pleasure for the emperor, would become a public spectacle of punishment and decay. The stench of fear would cling to you like cheap perfume. The emperor might give you lavish gifts, a villa, a necklace of emeralds, but these were not tokens of affection. They were payments, transactions, keeping you compliant, keeping you quiet. They were chains, not adornments. And the moment your youth faded, or a newer, fresher face appeared, or, God forbid, you showed any hint of political ambition, those gifts would be stripped away. You'd be discarded, sometimes thrown into the street, sometimes exiled to a remote, desolate island. Your former prestige would become a mark of shame, a scarlet letter in all but name. Your life, once a fleeting moment of proximity to power, would unravel into destitution and quiet suffering. You would crawl back into the shadows, a forgotten toy, a discarded piece of flesh. The Roman mistress wasn't just a lover, she was a political landmine, ready to explode at the slightest misstep, burying herself in the rubble of someone else's power struggle. It was a game where the only real winners were the ones who didn't play. A bitter pill to swallow, isn't it? All that assumed glamour, smeared with the reality of fear, control, and ultimately, abject disposal. Now let's shamble from the sun-drenched, blood-soaked arenas of Rome to the damp, disease-ridden castles of medieval Europe, where the church held sway and sin was not just a concept, but a weapon. Forget the chivalric romances and the troubadours singing of courtly love. That was just a PR campaign for a period defined by raw, brutal power and suffocating hypocrisy. Here, kings and nobles, devoutly Christian on paper, were often as horny and as indiscriminate as their Roman predecessors, but with an added layer of religious guilt and societal repression. A king's official marriage was a political contract designed to secure alliances and produce legitimate heirs. His mistress, however, was a dangerous secret, a source of both carnal pleasure and profound, eternal damnation in the eyes of the church. The act itself was a sin, but the consequences, they were reserved almost exclusively for the woman. She was the temptress, the Eve, the vessel of corruption. Her body, the very site of the king's transgression, was deemed an instrument of the devil. And the children? Oh, the bastards. The medieval world had a peculiar obsession with bloodlines and legitimacy, fueled by the church's condemnation of anything outside the marital bed. A royal bastard, if acknowledged, was a potential rival to the legitimate heir, a living, breathing threat to the stability of the realm. But more often, they were simply an embarrassment, a stain on the royal lineage. So, what happened to the unfortunate women who carried the king's illicit seed? Forced abortions were still prevalent, though now cloaked in the guise of medicinal remedies or divine intervention. If the child was born, it might be quietly murdered, a misfortune or a stillbirth, easily covered up in a time before forensics. Or the child would be spirited away to a remote monastery or convent, raised in anonymity, forever denied their royal parentage. The mother, too, would often find herself condemned to a similar fate, banished to a nunnery, her hair shorn, her body covered by coarse wool, her days spent in forced prayer and penitence, a life sentence of spiritual and physical imprisonment designed to cleanse her of her sins. The humiliation wasn't just private, it was often public, a terrifying example set for other women. Imagine a woman caught in the king's embrace, then publicly shamed, perhaps even whipped through the streets, her hair shorn, her face branded, her reputation, her honor, her very soul utterly destroyed. The fear of discovery was a constant companion, a chill that seeped into her bones. Every shared glance, every hushed whisper, every strange sickness could be a sign of the king's wife's wrath or the church's unforgiving eye. She lived in a perpetual state of dread, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering when the axe would fall. And it always did. A king might show fleeting affection, perhaps build her a small chapel, or gift her some land, but these were transient mercies. They didn't protect her from the queen's fury, or the ecclesiastical courts, or the chilling judgment of God-fearing common folk. She was, in essence, a walking sin, a pariah in waiting. The sheer absurdity of it all is almost comical, if it weren't so damn tragic. The king, the pious Christian, could indulge his lust with impunity, confess his sins, do penance, and receive absolution. He could then return to his wife and his throne, his soul ostensibly cleansed. But the woman? Her body was the instrument of his sin, and she bore the brunt of the punishment, her life often ruined, her name blackened, her future bleak. She was the repository of all their shared shame, a living sacrifice on the altar of male desire and patriarchal control. Her only resolution was bitter survival, often in silence, hidden away from the world that had used and discarded her. The concept of courtly love was a cruel joke, a thin veil over the very real violence and disposability inherent in these illicit relationships. There was no escaping the stench of judgment, the suffocating grip of a society that condemned her for being exactly what the king wanted her to be. It makes you almost miss the straightforward, pagan brutality of Rome, doesn't it? At least they were honest about the poison. Moving on, let's tiptoe through the perfumed, blood-splattered halls of Renaissance Europe, particularly Italy and France, where power and pleasure were intertwined like serpents in a particularly venomous Kama Sutra. Forget the romantic notion of artist muses and intellectual salons. These courts were less about beauty and more about brutal Machiavellian chess, and the king's mistress was often the most vulnerable pawn on the board. The air here was thick with intrigue, whispers, and the ever-present threat of poison. Literally. Love potions were a thing, yes, but often they were just cleverly disguised toxins designed to eliminate rivals or control unsuspecting lovers. Imagine being a woman in this era, prized for your beauty and wit, paraded by the king, but knowing every sip from a goblet, every morsel of food, could be your last. The paranoia must have been a constant, gnawing throb behind the eyes. Take Catherine de' Medici, for instance, a queen who knew a thing or two about power. She employed an army of perfumed ladies, her flying squadron of beautiful, intelligent women who were, in reality, spies. They were strategically placed in the beds of powerful men, extracting secrets, sowing discord, and occasionally delivering carefully concocted poisons. Now imagine being one of these women, a political tool, your body a means to an end, your intimacy a weapon for someone else's agenda. You might be the king's favored mistress one day, privy to his most intimate thoughts, feeling a fleeting sense of power. The next, you could be implicated in a plot, real or imagined, and find yourself writhing in agony as a slow-acting poison choked the life from your lungs. There was no real trust, no genuine affection, only transactional lust and cold, hard calculations of power. Your body was not your own. It was a contested territory, a battleground for dukes, queens, and kings. Every spasm, every cough, every ache would trigger a wave of gut-wrenching fear. The most dangerous game, perhaps, was bearing a child. While some royal bastards gained recognition, like Cesare Borgia, the vast majority were either convenient political tools or inconvenient embarrassments. For a mistress, a pregnancy was a ticking time bomb. If the queen was barren, a royal mistress might temporarily rise in favor, her womb becoming a national asset. But what if the queen finally conceived? Then the mistress's child became a threat, a shadow on the legitimate heir. Infanticide disguised as miscarriage or infant mortality was not uncommon, or the child would be legitimized but stripped of any real claim, its very existence a testament to a fleeting, illicit moment. The mistress herself, having served her purpose, would be discarded, often with a generous pension to ensure her silence, or banished from court, her beauty having faded, her utility expired. Her very existence was an open wound, a constant reminder of the king's weakness and infidelity. The luxury, the jewels, the sumptuous silks were all part of the charade, a glittering facade over a pit of vipers. These women were not just kept mistresses, they were pawns in a grand, deadly game of thrones, and their sexual agency was an illusion. Their bodies were instruments of statecraft, their desires secondary to the demands of their powerful paramours. They lived in a constant state of precarity. One false move, one whispered accusation, one shift in the political winds, and their world could come crashing down. They might survive physically, perhaps, if they were lucky enough to be exiled rather than poisoned or imprisoned. But their emotional landscape would be ravaged, their trust shattered, their sense of self reduced to a mere reflection of the king's fleeting attention. It was a life of exquisite torment, a dance on the edge of a cliff where one wrong step meant oblivion. The only resolution was often the slow, silent decay of a life lived in fear and shame. Pretty brutal, isn't it? All that assumed glamour smeared with the reality of fear, control, and ultimately abject disposal. All right, let's shuffle forward to Tudor England, where Henry VIII, that rotund, syphilitic monarch, turned his bedchamber into a literal death trap. Forget all the flowery poems about courtly love. Henry's court was a snake pit, and his mistresses, well, they weren't just playing with fire, they were dancing naked in a bonfire, waiting for the flames to lick their flesh. Take Mary Boleyn, for instance. Poor Mary. She was Henry's mistress before her sister, Anne, ever caught his wandering eye. Mary was fertile, apparently, giving Henry a son and a daughter, both acknowledged as his, but conveniently given the surname Carey, not Tudor. This was a king, mind you, desperate for a male heir, so you'd think he'd cherish the woman who gave him one. Nope. Once he grew tired of Mary, he discarded her like a used napkin and set his sights on the more ambitious, more captivating Anne. Mary lived, but faded into obscurity, her children mere footnotes. Not exactly a glorious career, was it? Then there's Anne Boleyn, a woman who played the game of power and lust with an audacity rarely seen. She refused to be just another mistress. She demanded the crown, and she got it after Henry tore England apart, literally, to divorce Catherine of Aragon. For a while, Anne was queen, but her reign was short, volatile, and ultimately lethal. She gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but no living son. And in Henry's diseased mind, a woman's worth was solely tied to her ability to pop out a male heir. He accused her of incest, of witchcraft, of treason, of having 6 fingers on one hand, anything to get rid of her. Imagine, if you dare, the utter terror of being accused of sleeping with your own brother, of plotting the king's death, all while being pregnant with a child that could have saved you. The public shame, the scrutiny, the fear of your body being examined for signs of witchcraft, the sheer, suffocating paranoia. Her trial was a farce, her guilt predetermined. Henry wanted a new wife, and Anne was in the way. Her resolution? A French executioner, a specially imported sword, and a very public decapitation on Tower Hill. Her head, separated from her body, was a grotesque payoff to Henry's insatiable desire for control and his fear of female power. She was reduced to a bloody spectacle, her life and body utterly consumed by the king's brutal whims. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the ultimate fate of the glamorous royal mistress under a truly monstrous patriarch. No heroic arc, just a cycle of lust, power, and the ultimate punishment. The irony, of course, is that her daughter, Elizabeth, became one of England's greatest monarchs, a queen who never married, perhaps learning a thing or two about the dangers of a royal bed. The entire court was complicit, a sprawling network of sycophants and spies, each person vying for favour, ready to betray anyone for a scrap of influence. The women of Henry's court, whether wife, mistress, or lady-in-waiting, existed in a constant state of vulnerability. Their bodies, their fertility, their very breath were subjects of royal scrutiny. They were objects, not people, to be used, enjoyed, and discarded at leisure. The air must have throbbed with unacknowledged desire, simmering resentment, and a thick, cloying fear. It makes you sweat just thinking about it. The Tudor court, often depicted as a place of grandeur, was, in reality, a blood-soaked arena where a woman's sexuality was her most dangerous liability. It was a period where the intimacy of the bedchamber was a direct conduit to the scaffold, a grim testament to the fact that for many women, being loved by the king was truly a death sentence. Right, let's swing over to the dazzling yet deeply diseased court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, at Versailles. Forget the powdered wigs and the elaborate balls for a moment. This was a man who centralized power, not just politically, but sexually, making his mistresses an integral, if highly precarious, part of the public spectacle. He wasn't just having affairs, he was creating a formal hierarchy of illicit relationships, with the unfortunate women caught in his orbit performing a dangerous, high-stakes ballet of desire and despair. The Sun King's court was a gilded cage, and his mistresses, adorned with the finest silks and jewels, were often trapped birds, their wings clipped by social expectations and the king's insatiable ego. Madame de Montespan, for instance, held court as the official mistress for years, producing several legitimate children with the king. Sounds glamorous, right? Wrong. Her life was an endless performance. She had to attend every public event, every ceremony, every meal, often sitting near the queen, enduring the silent, venomous glares. Her very presence was an open wound, a constant humiliation for the legitimate consort. Imagine the sheer psychological torture of that existence. You are praised, yes, but for your body, for your ability to please, for your fertile womb, all in the full, unblinking view of a court obsessed with status and public display. And Louis, ever the monarch, would eventually grow tired. He had a literal parade of mistresses, each replacing the last with a chilling efficiency. When Montespan fell out of favor, it wasn't a private, tearful goodbye. It was a public shaming, orchestrated to perfection. She was suspected of dabbling in the affair of the poisons, a scandal that rocked France, involving black masses, child sacrifices, and literal attempts to poison members of the court. Whether she was guilty or simply a convenient scapegoat, her fall was absolute. She was effectively banished, her glory turned to ashes, her life ending in religious penance, a far cry from the opulent days of her reign as royal favorite. Then there's the issue of health. The French court, with its rampant promiscuity, was a breeding ground for venereal diseases. Syphilis, a silent killer, would creep through the royal chambers, leaving its victims with grotesque sores, madness, and slow, agonizing decay. A mistress might offer her body for pleasure, but she risked not just her reputation, but her very physical integrity. Her beauty, her currency, would literally rot away. And the children? Louis was prolific, fathering numerous bastards who were later legitimized and given titles. But their lives were often tragic, defined by their liminal status. Royal, but not quite. Their mothers, having fulfilled their reproductive duty, were often cast aside or confined to convents, or simply forgotten, their wombs no longer of value. Every birth, every illness, every subtle change in the king's mood was a terrifying omen. The superficial splendor of Versailles masked a profound rot. The courtesans and mistresses were disposable commodities, their bodies existing for the fleeting gratification of one man and the political machinations of an entire court. Their true feelings, their desires, their suffering were irrelevant. They were just gears in the monstrous clockwork of the monarchy, expected to turn and grind until they broke. The emotional journey for these women was one of initial hope, perhaps quickly dissolving into disgust, then amusement at the absurdities, then horror at the true cost, and finally a bleak reflection on a life lived as another man's property. No heroic arcs, just cycles of lust, power, and punishment. The women were trapped in a constant cycle of performance, their every movement scrutinized, their every breath a calculated risk. The sheen of luxury was just a distraction from the suffocating lack of agency, the constant gnawing fear of the moment their bodies would cease to be useful, and they would be cast aside. Now let's descend further into the abyss of French royal depravity, specifically Louis XV's notorious Parc aux Cerfs, or Deer Park. Forget any remaining illusions of stately romance. This wasn't a courtly love affair. It was a glorified state-sponsored child brothel, a stark testament to unchecked royal power and the utter disposability of young female bodies. Louis XV, unlike his great-grandfather, was a man consumed by ennui and a particularly dark strain of lust. He didn't want the complications of a formal mistress like Madame de Pompadour, who demanded political influence and intellectual stimulation. He wanted purely carnal gratification without the bother of emotional attachment or public scrutiny. So he had his agents procure young women, often from humble backgrounds, sometimes even underage, and house them in a secluded complex in Versailles. These girls weren't just common prostitutes, they were specifically selected for their youth, their innocence, their lack of social standing, making them utterly vulnerable. Imagine being one of these girls. You're plucked from obscurity, perhaps promised a better life, perhaps coerced, perhaps simply sold. You're given new clothes, a room, a semblance of luxury, only to realize you are a prisoner, your sole purpose to satisfy the king's fleeting urges. There was no pretense of affection, no grand gestures, just raw, transactional sex. These were not relationships, they were encounters. Your body was subjected to medical inspections to ensure your health and virginity before you were presented to the king. A hymenal inspection was likely just the beginning. The act itself would be quick, perfunctory, and utterly devoid of intimacy. Your every groan, every shudder, every shiver of fear would be noted, perhaps even enjoyed by the jaded monarch. You were a warm, compliant vessel, a temporary diversion from the burdens of the crown. The fear wouldn't be of public humiliation, but of private, silent disposal. What happened when these girls became pregnant? An inconvenient complication. The child would be quickly aborted, often through brutal, crude methods, or, if born, whisked away, never to be seen again, their existence utterly erased from any official record. The young mother, having served her biological purpose, or failed to if the abortion was successful, would be paid off, sworn to secrecy and sent away back to obscurity, her body perhaps damaged, her spirit certainly broken. Her entire life could be summed up as a brief, sordid period of being a royal meat puppet. There was no ascent, no power gained, just pure, unadulterated exploitation. The Parc aux Cerfs wasn't just a place, it was a system, a grinding machine that consumed innocence and spit out broken women. The luxury provided was a thin veil over the moral filth. The constant stream of fresh young bodies was a testament to the king's bottomless, empty desires and the utter lack of empathy from those who facilitated it. The sexual horror here is that it wasn't about pleasure, but about control, about reducing human beings to pure, base function. The girls were stripped of their agency, their dignity, their future. They lived in a grotesque limbo, isolated from society, used and discarded, their lives a silent testament to the debauchery of a monarchy teetering on the edge of collapse. Their resolutions were bleak, perhaps a quiet, anonymous life, if they survived, haunted by the memory of their exploitation. More often, obscurity, poverty, or a premature death from the crude medical procedures or the sheer psychological trauma. It was a dark, oozing stain on the already tarnished reputation of the French monarchy, a brutal reminder that behind the velvet and lace lay the cold, hard mechanics of power, reducing human flesh to mere chattel. This isn't just dark humor, it's a cold, hard stare into the vacant eyes of ultimate power and the depths of exploitation it can reach. It's truly a choking sensation to consider the sheer scale of the abuse. All right, let's travel east, far from the syphilitic French courts to the opulent, yet equally brutal confines of the Ottoman harem. Forget Disney's Aladdin and all that flowery nonsense. The harem was not some romantic playground. It was a golden cage, a meticulously structured world of intricate power struggles where a woman's rise or fall was often decided by a eunuch's whisper or a swift, silent execution. The Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, maintained hundreds, sometimes thousands of women. These weren't mistresses in the Western sense, they were concubines, slaves, or captive princesses, all vying for his fleeting attention, and more importantly, for the chance to bear him a son, thus elevating their status to sultana. The competition was a gnawing, constant throb of anxiety. Imagine being one of these women, a new arrival, often kidnapped or purchased from distant lands. You'd be stripped, inspected, given a new name, and thrust into a world governed by ancient customs and brutal hierarchies. Your beauty was your only currency, your fertility your only hope. But your body was not your own. It was a vessel for the sultan's seed, and your womb a potential factory for future power. The harem was run by the sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, a formidable figure who wielded immense power, often deciding which concubine would even share the sultan's bed on any given night. She was the ultimate gatekeeper, and her favor was a matter of life or death. Rivalries among the concubines were legendary, often devolving into literal poisonings, curses, and intricate plots to sabotage a rival's chances. The air was thick with whispered accusations and simmering hatred.
And the eunuchs, these castrated men, often African slaves, were the guards, the enforcers, the silent observers of the harem's most intimate moments. They were the Valide Sultan's eyes and ears, and their power was immense, though often unseen. They carried out the Valide Sultan's orders, from delivering love letters to delivering silent death sentences.
The silk cord was a favored method of execution within the harem, a discreet way to strangle a concubine or a prince who had fallen out of favor. Imagine the silent horror of seeing a eunuch approach with that thin, silken rope, knowing your fate was sealed, that your life, once filled with fleeting luxury, was about to be snuffed out in a suffocating, ignominious end. There was no trial, no public outcry, just a body quietly removed, its existence erased, as if it never was. The very thought makes one want to crawl into a dark corner. A woman who bore a son to the sultan, elevating her to sultana, was not safe either. Her son, once grown, became a threat to his half-brothers, and the cycle of murder and intrigue continued. The tradition of fratricide, where a new sultan would often kill all his brothers to prevent challenges to his rule, meant that a mother's greatest triumph could become her greatest sorrow. Her son, her flesh and blood, might be strangled by the silk cord, and she, his mother, would then be cast out, or worse, forced to witness his demise. The emotional triggers here are profound: shame, public exposure, even if within the harem's confines, exploitation, and intimacy as control. The conflict was constant, the resolution, often a bitter survival marked by loss and the chilling knowledge that your life was utterly expendable. The Ottoman harem was a place of breathtaking beauty and suffocating brutality, a testament to the dark side of absolute power and the tragic fate of women caught in its gilded web. The smell of fear must have been as potent as the exotic perfumes. Now let's trot over to the vast, cold steppes of Russia, specifically the Romanov era, where empresses like Catherine the Great held absolute power, and their lovers, while seemingly privileged, often met chilling ends. Forget the romantic notion of powerful empresses showering their chosen men with gifts and glory. In Catherine's world, her favorites were indeed elevated, given titles, land, and immense wealth, but they existed on a razor's edge. Her love was a capricious, dangerous thing, and her disfavor a direct path to Siberia or an early grave. These were not mistresses in the traditional sense, as Catherine was the monarch, and they were her male favorites or lovers, but the power dynamic was chillingly similar. One person wielded absolute authority, and the other existed solely at their whim. Take Grigory Potemkin, perhaps Catherine's most famous lover. He was immensely powerful, a de facto co-ruler for years, but even he understood the precariousness of his position. He always knew he could be replaced, his influence stripped away in an instant, if he ceased to be useful or entertaining. And what happened to those who truly fell out of favor? The outcomes were rarely pleasant. They might be banished to a remote estate, stripped of their titles, their wealth confiscated. Or, more ominously, they might meet with an accident, poisons, staged duels, or simply disappearing into the vast, unforgiving Siberian wilderness were all possibilities. Imagine living with that gnawing anxiety, knowing that the woman you shared your bed with, the woman who had elevated you beyond your wildest dreams, could also sign your death warrant with a flick of her wrist. Every shared embrace, every whispered secret was a calculated risk. Catherine herself was a woman who rose to power through a coup, orchestrating the murder of her own husband. She was a pragmatist, utterly ruthless, and her emotional attachments were always secondary to the stability of her rule. Her lovers were not just sources of pleasure, they were political tools, extensions of her power, their influence a reflection of her favor. Once that utility expired, or they became too ambitious, or simply bored her, they were gone. Her successor, Paul I, Catherine's son, was a paranoid and deeply unstable man. Upon his ascension, he took great pleasure in punishing those who had been close to his mother, especially her former lovers. Some were arrested, tortured, imprisoned, or executed. The cycle of power and revenge was relentless, and the former favorites, now old and vulnerable, bore the brunt of it. Their lives, once so gilded, ended in abject humiliation or swift, brutal death. The narrative here is a fascinating reversal of the traditional mistress dynamic, but the core themes remain: exploitation, intimacy as control, and the ultimate disposability of those who dare to enter the bed of absolute power. These men, for all their temporary grandeur, were still objects, their bodies and minds serving the whims of the monarch. Their growth arc? None. Only exposure to the absurd and horrifying norms of a despotic court. The conflict was always about status and survival, and the resolution often a grim descent into oblivion or a desperate, bitter clinging to life in exile. The opulent palaces of St. Petersburg and Moscow, much like Versailles, were not havens of romance, but arenas where ambitious men, much like their female counterparts in other courts, found themselves crushed under the heavy boot of royal caprice. The moans of pleasure would soon give way to gasps of terror, and finally the choking silence of ultimate defeat. It leaves a smear of dread on the soul, doesn't it? Now let's cast our gaze further east, to the ancient imperial courts of China, Japan, and Korea. Forget the serene imagery of cherry blossoms and delicate tea ceremonies. These harems, filled with imperial concubines, were often far more brutal, more structured, and more deeply dehumanizing than anything seen in the West. This wasn't just about the emperor's pleasure, it was about dynastic continuation, about ritual, and about an incredibly complex, deadly hierarchy of female competition. The emperor could have thousands of concubines categorized by rank, each assigned specific duties, each praying for a night in the emperor's bed, a chance to conceive a son, and thus elevate her family's status. The sheer scale of it all is mind-boggling, a vast human zoo designed for one man's absolute dominion. Imagine being chosen as a concubine. You're beautiful, yes, but also often from a provincial family, and your entire lineage's future rests on your ability to please the emperor and bear a male heir. You would enter the forbidden city, never to leave, your life a constant performance of submission and a desperate scramble for favor. Your body would be meticulously prepared, bathed, perfumed, massaged, adorned in elaborate silks, often with painful, restrictive garments like corsets, or, in China, your feet, painfully bound from childhood to achieve the lotus foot ideal of beauty, making every step an act of agony. Then you'd wait. For days, weeks, months, perhaps years. Most concubines never even saw the emperor, let alone shared his bed. They lived lives of quiet despair, their beauty fading, their youth wasted in isolation. The air would be thick with unspoken resentments and seething jealousies, a truly rank environment for the spirit. But if you were lucky enough to catch the emperor's eye, the real dangers began. The empress and higher-ranking concubines viewed every potential rival as a direct threat. Accusations of witchcraft, poisoning, or simply disrespect were common. If you became pregnant, the tension would reach a fever pitch. If it was a boy, triumph, but also immense danger. The child would be constantly at risk from rivals, and you, the mother, would be a target. Infanticide, disguised as natural causes, was rampant within these imperial harems, or if the child was sickly or female, it might be quietly disposed of. The ultimate power here was often wielded not by the emperor directly, but by his mother, the empress dowager, or by the chief eunuch, who controlled access to the emperor and knew every secret, every weakness. These eunuchs were the true power brokers, pulling strings from the shadows, capable of making or breaking a concubine's life with a single whispered word. Their authority was absolute, their cruelty often chillingly detached, and the resolutions rarely happy. If a concubine's son became emperor, she might rise to empress dowager, but even then her life was one of constant vigilance, paranoia, and the crushing weight of ritual. More often, a concubine would fall out of favor, perhaps due to aging or a new favorite appearing. She might be stripped of her rank, confined to a desolate palace, starved, or even forced to commit ritual suicide for some trumped-up infraction. Her entire existence, her body, her fertility, her very breath were controlled commodities, disposable and utterly expendable once their utility expired. The sexual horror lies in the sheer scale of the dehumanization, the reduction of thousands of women to mere instruments of dynastic reproduction and male pleasure. There was no escape, only a slow crawl towards oblivion, often marked by pain, isolation, and quiet suffering. The moans here were not of pleasure, but of submission, of exhaustion, and often of sheer, unadulterated fear. It's a testament to how power can twist human connection into something truly monstrous. So, we've dragged ourselves through centuries of royal filth, from Rome to Russia, through gilded palaces and suffocating harems. What have we learned from this glorious parade of historical depravity and the miserable fate of those who dared to share a monarch's bed? We've seen that the royal mistress wasn't some independent, empowered figure who rose to prominence through her wiles. No, she was almost universally a disposable commodity, her body, her fertility, and her very life existing at the whim of a powerful man and the jealous machinations of his court. The illusion of glamour was just that, an illusion, a thin veneer of velvet and pearls covering a festering wound of exploitation and control. Her existence was a testament to unchecked male power and societal hypocrisy, where lust was indulged with impunity by one party and punished mercilessly in the other. Whether it was the Roman empress's poison, the medieval church's anathema, Henry VIII's convenient accusations of treason, Louis XIV's public shaming, Louis XV's child brothel, or the Ottoman harem's silk cord, the outcome for these women was disturbingly consistent. Their intimacy was control, their love was a transaction, and their power was a fragile, fleeting fantasy that could be shattered by a single whisper or a change in the political wind. Their bodies were not their own. They were state property, used for breeding, for pleasure, for political espionage, and then discarded. The emotional journey for these women was rarely one of triumph or self-discovery. Instead, it was a terrifying descent into shame, public exposure, exploitation, and often a bleak, silent survival, haunted by the spectre of what they endured. There were no hero arcs here, only cycles of lust, power, and the grim, crushing weight of punishment. The core conflict was always sexual or status-based oppression, and the resolution was almost universally emotional or physical humiliation, or the bitterest kind of survival. These women lived with the constant throb of paranoia, the taste of fear in their mouths, and the chilling knowledge that their lives were fundamentally expendable. The casual cruelty, the religious hypocrisy, the systemic abuse, all wrapped in a cloak of perceived grandeur, makes one's stomach churn. It truly highlights that throughout history, power structures, particularly patriarchal ones, have had a nasty habit of reducing human beings, especially women, to mere instruments. Their stories, often silenced or sanitized, are a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked power and the pervasive filth that lingers in its shadow. So next time you see a movie where the king's mistress is living her best life, remember the stench of fear, the ooze of disease, the crawl of paranoia, and the sickening feeling of being utterly disposable. Remember the blood, the shame, and the moans that were not of ecstasy, but of terror. Because history, my friends, is rarely as romantic as the storytellers want you to believe. It's far more brutal, far more cynical, and far more honest about the dark hearts of men. And the fate of a royal mistress? Well, it was a death sentence, whether by steel, poison, or the slow, agonizing decay of a life stripped bare. You might find it amusing or horrifying, but you can't deny its brutal truth.